Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Tina Ngata, and I am a Ngāti Porou woman from the nation of Ngāti Porou on the east coast of Te Ika Māui, also known as the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm a part of the ocean nation of Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, also called the Pacific Ocean, and this ocean nation includes my relations across the spaces of Hawaii, of Tahiti, of Rarotonga, Tumutunua Varo, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga. Within that space, I identify myself as an Indigenous ocean person. And I don't just mean that in the geographic sense. I mean that in the sense that I am the ocean as a person. Genealogically, I trace my descent from the ocean. We have a practice called oriori. It's a kind of a lullaby that we sing to our children when they are still inside the waters of their mother. Those oriori recite their genealogy going all the way back to our ancestor ocean. Growing children and new generations of people who understand their genealogical connection to the oceans, to the lands, to the skies. In that sense, is very much also an issue of protecting our women, is very much an issue of protecting our waters. It's very much an issue of protecting our traditional ways of birthing and rearing our children. That is not just an environmental issue. The climate crisis is really not an environmental problem. It is a human problem that is being visited upon all of our relations, human and environmental alike. And so we're not going to technologically develop ourselves out of what is essentially a problem of human mindsets that has been entrenched now for over 500 years. And it was globalized as a system of entitlement and a psyche of entitlement. And it was globalized as a form of political domination. And it was globalized as the foundation of our global economy and domestic economies through the application of the doctrine of discovery. And when that happened, many of these systems of power, particularly in colonial contexts, resulted in the dehumanizing and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. Likewise, the global economy was set up upon the dispossession and dehumanizing of Indigenous peoples, and it is still today maintained through the dispossession and dehumanizing of Indigenous peoples. Where colonialism is maintained, that is only happening at the expense of the human rights of Indigenous peoples. And so because of that, what you'll find is that in relation to environmental racism, all forms of racism, colonial racism towards Indigenous peoples, because it is fundamental to global and domestic economies, is often the last kind of racism to be dealt with and acknowledged. Imperial entitlement has manifested in a number of ways and spaces. So in some spaces, for instance, in Nauru and Banaba in the Pacific, that has manifested as imperial entitlement to phosphate, where the entire topsoil of these islands has been drawn off, including the bones of their ancestors, in order to be able to create fertilizer to feed the agricultural economies of New Zealand and Australia. And now we see that happening in the Western Sahara as well, where phosphate lands are being, mined in order to create fertilizer industries. So that's a form of imperial entitlement. Food systems are another form of imperial entitlement, where people can over-extract from other people's lands, or even just steal Indigenous lands for the purposes of creating these multinational food systems and corporate imperial food systems that then displace Indigenous food systems. That's another form of imperial entitlement. And so the oil and gas industry and the plastics industries are really kind of conjoined twins in that sense, insofar as we're often talking about the same players. And in fact, the plastics are often produced in the same facilities, but also they are both driven from the same imperialist mindset that is present in these early papal bulls from the Doctrine of Discovery, which say even then that you may take the lands and the bodies of these people for your profit. And the dehumanizing of peoples and the dispossession of peoples for the purpose of profit has been embedded in these mindsets that has then been globalized economically and politically. And that is what we need to unpick if we have any hope of getting to the root of the climate crisis, of getting to the root of the plastics pollution crisis, of getting to the root of water scarcity, where people's entitlement to water has resulted in commodification of water to the point where 700 million people within the next decade will be displaced from water scarcity. But that has been accepted because this imperial entitlement has been normalized and legitimized within domestic and global frameworks. And so, you know, many people who enjoy these spaces of economic and political privilege ignore these facts. And we really can't carry on with this charade of wanting to solve the planet, but not when it causes us discomfort and not when it calls upon us to give up our own positions of power and privilege. Those positions of power and privilege come at the expense of Indigenous peoples. And until that is recognized and justice in that space is restored, then climate justice is only ever going to remain a mirage. Until colonial racism against Indigenous peoples is addressed, and until Indigenous justice is restored through the return of Indigenous lands and the protection of Indigenous peoples and their rights, until that is restored, our anti-racism work is not done. And also what that means is that looking after Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights, the protection of our women, the protection of our children, the protection of our languages, of our ceremonies, of our sciences, Indigenous sciences, which understand the language of the planet and the patterns in order to be able to recognize when something is out of kilter. Until those things are collectively recognized and protected, then we're not going to really address the climate crisis. These things are tightly interwoven in Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing. And what we see too often is that Indigenous peoples are trotted out in an ornamental fashion for saviorism kind of environmental projects, and then put back in the box while colonial environmental saviors go about doing what they think is best for the environment. And that completely disregards the hundreds and sometimes thousands of years of a track record of sustainable practice and ways of knowing and being and doing that sit at the heart of living with Mother Earth and our Father Sky and our waters, as opposed to dominating over our earth and waters and sky. And so what's required of the planet now is a fundamental shift in mindset. Over and above any technological developments, it's a fundamental shift in mindset, which requires us to de-imperialize, to decolonize, to decentralize as well, and to devolve power down to local economies, down to local leadership, down to the people who know their places and spaces the best because they carry that genealogy of connection within them. And when those places and those people are not having to fight all of these other fights by themselves, when they're supported in general to be their unapologetic Indigenous selves, the planet benefits from that. So protecting Indigenous women is an act of resistance against the climate crisis. Protecting Indigenous children, protecting Indigenous languages, protecting Indigenous arts, protecting our Indigenous food systems, all of these things are powerful acts of resistance against the climate crisis. And what we see too often are Indigenous peoples who are utilised in relation to environmental issues, but when it comes to protecting our language, we look around and our allies are nowhere to be seen. When it comes to protecting our women, we look around and our allies are nowhere to be seen. And for us, we do not separate these things. It's one and the same. And that is an aspect of decolonizing and de-imperializing our mindsets in order to be able to approach the crisis in an Indigenous way, which is a connected way. How do we reconnect? Well, Indigenous peoples are famed at maintaining relationships to our places and spaces and concepts and to each other. We've done that in a way that has maintained our worlds and our ecosystems around us for hundreds of years. That's the underpinning factor behind us looking after 80% of the world's biodiversity, even though we operate on less than 1/5 of our traditional territories that we originally inhabited, even on such a diminished remaining lands. That 80% of the world's biodiversity is also a huge factor in fighting the climate crisis. Our Indigenous managed forests sequester 33 times the global carbon emissions on any one year. And that's not including, of course, other aspects such as our grasslands, our wetlands, our oceanic territories. All of those are also very effective carbon sinks, which when they're under Indigenous management, outperform any other form of carbon sequestration. So we have this demonstrated capacity to be able to deal to the climate crisis. And that means that, you know, looking after Indigenous rights, Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing is not just an issue of our rights, it is an issue of planetary well-being. That means that looking after our Indigenous information systems, our Indigenous knowledge systems, and spaces of wisdom are vital in this space. If we are to be the advisory resource and the leadership resource that we have demonstrated we have the capacity to be, then protecting those spaces is really pivotal right now. And so the way in which the integrity of Indigenous knowledge, the integrity of Indigenous wisdom is protected within this information scape is also a vital issue. For Indigenous peoples, we really need to be able to protect our ceremonial spaces, our food system spaces, our calendrical systems, our sciences that understand the patterns and the voices of the planet so that we can identify what it is that she's saying to us. So the unique position that funders hold in relation to everything that I've been talking about is that they would have the opportunity to be able to rectify the injustice that many of them may be involved in. You know, the way in which funds have been channeled and moved around this planet for the last 500 years has placed economic privilege within the hands of a few and has impoverished many others, and in that space of impoverishment, of economic impoverishment, are many Indigenous peoples. Where we come unstuck is often where funders start to fund other large non-Indigenous groups with the understanding that they may then devolve some money down to Indigenous groups. And that's first of all, that's not responding to their role in this story of privilege and colonial management of funds, both globally and domestically. So it's not responding to that story, but also it's not effective because many of those funds are not making it down to the Indigenous communities, who still really do carry a lot of those knowledge systems. You know, it's these subsistence communities in particular who understand how to maintain these relationships whilst providing for themselves and for their local communities as well. And so those subsistence communities need to be funded directly. The, for instance, ocean voyaging communities, those canoes need to be funded directly as well, so that they can carry out the very good work that they do, not be funded through these middle systems that can often fall prey to NGO imperialism and NGO colonialism. And so, yeah, responding to the injustice that many funders are a part of involves making direct relationships with these communities and funding them to carry out the very good work that they do, and understanding what success looks like, understanding that success does not just look like in your very small siloed perspective of, you know, this many species or that many species. It also looks like Indigenous women thriving and Indigenous birthrights thriving and Indigenous child rearing thriving and health rates thriving and our schools and our language thriving. All of those are also environmental wins and climate wins. So when you understand that as being outcomes that support a healthy climate and healthy environment, then you are responding to this 500-year story of injustice that also often underpins the economic privilege of many funders. But what this means also for Indigenous allies is that if the climate crisis is urgent, and we all understand it to be urgent, we all understand that it can't wait another day for us to take urgent action, then it should be equally urgent for people to transition past acknowledging us in their acceptance speeches and trotting us out as the ornaments for their environmental saviors projects. And it needs for them to allow for Indigenous peoples to step into those leadership spaces to take us forward and, you know, promulgate the good work that we have already demonstrated that we're capable of doing. That also means that for Indigenous peoples, we need to be really focusing on what Indigenous leadership means over and above being Indigenous and being in a leadership role. What are the aspects of Indigenous leadership that have resulted in these stories of success, whether those stories of success relate to protecting biodiversity or sinking carbon or shutting down oil and gas industry on our lands and territories, like here on the East Coast, where we have chased off and shut down 5 oil and gas prospecting companies, and where nationally we have moved our nation to a space of banning oil and gas prospecting off our coastlines. And so all of those things are forms of Indigenous leadership that should be supported. So if what we are looking at in the climate crisis is this extension of an experience of colonialism and imperialism that is eventually going to consume itself and is a story where Indigenous intervention is required, then funders really need to consider what their role has been in that story up till now. And what do they want their role in this story to be right now? And what do they want their role in that story to be in the future? How do they want to be remembered in this 500-year-long story of colonial and imperial entitlement to bodies, to lands, to waters, and to futures? What do they want their legacy to be and their role to be in that story? Regardless of what happened in the past, how are you going to respond to that past in the present? And how are you going to change the future with the decisions that you make today?